MPI 2014. Sabina already presented the main methodology and the indicators that we use for the MPI yesterday, so we are not going to stop on that today. Instead, we're going to go directly into the findings. Basically, this year in the update of the MPI 2014, we follow this idea of leaving no one behind. So besides computing the global MPI that we have been computing since the beginning in 2010, we also included, well, we include more countries in the analysis of changes over time. And we also provide a new measure of inequality among the poor and a measure of destitution that we will talk about today. So I'm going to skip the methodology. This is going to be on the slides anyway. It's going to be available online in case you want to check it. In the MPI 2014, we have updated information for 33 countries. Actually, we have added two new countries and updated information for 31. And this means that we are now covering a total of 108 countries. And the period of time that we are analyzing is 2002 to 2013, being China the only country that goes back to 2002. At the beginning, when we first launched the MPI in 2010, all the data was covering the period 2000 to 2008, and we have actually now 60 data sets, 60 countries that have data that it's even newer than that. It's from 2008 onwards. So it has been a lot of updates in these 4 years since the MPI was first launched. Besides having the national measure, we also compute urban-rural disaggregation for 106 countries that allow this kind of breakdowns. We also have information for, in the case of 69 countries, we have information for 780 subnational regions, and we also have information for changes over time for 34 of these countries that Anna will present. Now, what we find is that across these 108 countries, we are covering a total of 5.4 billion people, which is nearly 78% of the world's population. And we find that 1.6 billion people are MPI poor, given our 10 indicators and our K of 1/3 to identify the MPI poor. This is nearly 30% of the world's population that is living under poverty. In this map, what we are presenting is the headcount of poverty. This is the proportion of people that are identified as MPI poor. Lighter greens imply that poverty is lower, while darker red color imply that the headcount of multidimensional poverty is higher. So as we can see, Africa concentrates the countries that have the highest headcount of poverty, or the highest proportion of people that are living in multidimensional poverty. We have updated the figures for Niger. We had data for 2007 up to last year, and now even using 2012 data, we still find that Niger is the poorest country of the 108 that we are considering. But now we have that 89% of the population in this country is poor. So there is no country that has a poverty rate or a poverty headcount of over 90%. However, we do find that there are 43 subnational regions that actually have more than 90% of their population living in poverty. Now here in the first pie, we are presenting the distribution of total population, and in the larger pie, we present the distribution of MPI poor in these regions. And what we can see is that South Asia concentrates 52% of the total MPI poor, while Sub-Saharan Africa concentrates nearly 30% of the MPI poor. So we see that these regions are those that have that are home of the largest proportion of MPI poor. Similarly, and this is also consistent to what we found in previous rounds of the MPI, we have that almost 71% of the MPI poor that we have identified in our analysis live actually in middle-income countries based on the World Bank income categories. So basically what we see is that there is no perfect overlap between these two definitions of income groups and MPI information. Now, as I was mentioning before, this year we have also analyzed information. We have also broken down the information by rural and urban areas, and we find that 85% of the MPI poor, or of those people that are identified as MPI poor, live in rural areas. This is this is significantly higher than the figure that it's usually presented for income poverty, which is around 71%. And what we see is that proportion is particularly high in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, that it's around 85–86% of the MPI poor. Now, in this graph, what we are presenting is basically the high of each of the bar is the proportion of people that are identified as MPI poor. So as we see, the first country over here, the first country on the left is Niger, as I was mentioning before, and then we have Slovakia and Slovenia as those countries with the lowest headcount of multidimensional poverty. And the black dots are the figures that we have for $125 a day data. So basically, this is a comparison between the headcount of multidimensional poverty and the headcount of the most traditional measure of poverty that it's used, that it's the $125 a day measured by the World Bank. In this case, we have only included the dots, the income poverty data, for those countries that have this information available for 3 years before or after our surveys, the surveys that we are using for our MPI, so that it's actually comparable. And what we see is that there is a lot of heterogeneity here. For some countries, both figures are similar, but there are many countries for which we have we have quite big differences between these two indicators. Basically, what we are trying to say here is that these measures are not substitutes. These are providing different information, and they should be used as complements. Now, Anna will talk about changes over time.
So this year, we expanded our analysis on changes over time. Thank you. It's this one? Mm-hmm.
No, the one to the side.
So we analyzed 34 countries from every region, both from our low-income countries and middle-income countries. We covered 338 subnational regions, covering also 2.5 billion of people. These 34 countries are countries for which there is a recent MPI, global MPI estimation, and also a comparable demographic and health survey across time. The MPI, the global MPI for each year, is computed using all information available. But in countries where changes in the survey design compromise the comparability across years, we strictly standardize the parameters. So the values that I'm presenting here of the MPI might not coincide with the global MPIs that were published before, because they had to be made comparable. Also, for different countries, we have different intervals of years between the two surveys. For instance, for Gabon, we have DHS 2000 and DHS 2012, while for Tanzania, we have DHS 2008 and DHS 2010. So to make comparisons between countries, we also computed the changes per year. We annualized changes. So how did these 34 countries perform in terms of reducing multidimensional poverty? We found that 30 of these 34 countries had statistically significant reductions. In this graph, you can see in the horizontal axis, it is the MPI in the first period of the comparison. And in the vertical axis is the annual change in the MPI. So the countries more to the right are the poorest countries in the first period, Nigeria and Ethiopia, while more to the left are the least poor country. I think Armenia, it was the least poor country in our sample. The countries in the bottom are the ones who perform better, our top performance in terms of reducing poverty. So Nepal and Rwanda were the countries that reduced the highest reduction per year in multidimensional poverty. Of these countries, only Bolivia and Ghana are middle-income countries. All the others are low-income countries, among the top performers. Sorry. The MPI provides incentive to reduce poverty in two ways: by reducing the percentage of multidimensional poor people, what we call incidence, or by reducing the share of the privations that multidimensional poor people experience, what we call intensity. So here, on the horizontal axis, you have the reduction per year, again, on the incidence, on the percentage of poor. While in the vertical axis, you have the reduction in incidence. So how did the countries perform? Most countries have actually reduced incidence faster than intensity. There are only two exceptions. It was Nigeria and Ethiopia. Those countries had a biggest reduction in intensity. In this graph, I'm only presenting the 10 top performers. And what is common to these 10 top performers is that they have strong reductions in both. So you can see Ghana, Nepal, Rwanda, and Bolivia are both to the left and to bottom. So they have reduced both strongly. They are among the best on both. How did the poverty reduce? Then you can also look at the censored head counts. And what we found is of the 34 countries, 10 have reduced significantly all MPI indicators. But the profiles of variation vary. For instance, in Rwanda, the biggest reductions were in sanitation and drinkable water. In Ghana was attendance and sanitation. In Tanzania, it was again sanitation and child mortality. And in Uganda, it was assets and drinkable water. One thing that was more or less common to most countries, 32 of them, were improvements in sanitation. 32 of our countries had significant improvements in sanitation. Then we looked by subnational regions, and we found that poverty significantly decreased in 208 of our subnational regions, which represent 78% of the MPI poor in our analysis. 8 countries have actually reduced poverty in all their subnational regions: Bangladesh, Bolivia, Gabon, Ghana, Malawi, Mozambique, Niger, and Rwanda. In 9 of the countries, the poorest region, the one with the largest MPI in the first period, has actually had the biggest reduction also in the MPI. And these countries are Bangladesh, Bolivia, Colombia, Egypt, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, and Niger. So the poorest region seems to be catching up. For the countries that we had information on ethnicity, we also decomposed the reduction in the MPI by main ethnic group. So here we have this disaggregation for Benin. Again, in the horizontal axis, you have the MPI at the starting period, and in the vertical, the annual change. So what you can see here for Benin is that the poorest group, the PO, are more to the right in terms of, so they have the highest poverty, has actually had a zero or almost zero change in the MPI. So the poorest country is not reducing MPI. They are falling behind. As an opposite example, we have Kenya. In Kenya, the poorest ethnic group, Somali, has actually had a reduction in poverty much stronger than any of the other ethnic groups. So these are good news. They are catching up. How would this picture change if we would look to income? If instead of looking to multidimensional poverty, we would look to income. In this graph, what we are presenting is the annual change in incidence, in the percentage of poor, by MPI, the red one, or by income, the $1.25 a day in orange. Oops. Nepal has performed very well in both. It has reduced incidence of both types of incidence in 4 percentage points a year. Rwanda, Ghana, and Bolivia, on the other hand, they performed very well in terms of the MPI incidence, but they reduced MPI incidence 2 to 3 times faster than income poverty. On the other hand, Niger, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Uganda, Cambodia are examples of the reverse, where income poverty reduced much faster than multidimensional poverty. So if progress was only measured by income, the examples of Rwanda, Ghana, and Bolivia, who had so big advances in reducing multidimensional poverty, would have been invisible. We wouldn't identify their success. Then I also want to talk a little bit, just a little bit, about inequality among the poor. This is the work of Schumann Seth, my colleagues Schumann Seth and Sabine Alkayer. So this year, they have computed a new measure of the inequality among the poor for 90 countries. They found that the highest levels of inequality were in sub-Saharan countries, South Asian countries, and Yemen and Somalia. The country with the highest inequality among the poor was Burkina Faso. In the majority of the 34 countries for which we have intertemporal data, the ones that I was talking before, what if they found is that the reduction in poverty was accompanied by a reduction in the inequality among the poor. They also analyzed the inequality or the disparity between subnational regions. And of the 31 countries for which we had subnational intertemporal data, they found that 15 showed also a reduction in disparity. Other 50 showed no reduction, but only one country has actually increased disparity, subnational disparity, and that was India. And now I'll pass to Adriana.
So now I will present the new measure of destitution that we computed this year. Basically, what we are trying to analyze here is those people that are at the bottom of the distribution, so the poorest of the poor, be able to identify and analyze the situation of those that are in a more extreme or in a deeper type of poverty. So we are using exactly the same indicators, the same 10 indicators and the same 3 dimensions that we do for the general MPI, for the global MPI. We have the same weights and we have the same poverty cutoff of 1/3 to be identified as destitute, just as in the general case. But what we are changing now is the deprivation cutoff. So for example, in order to be considered to be deprived in the global MPI, to be considered deprived in sanitation, you need to have an inadequate type of sanitation. So for example, you are sharing with another household or you have an unprotected latrine. In the case of destitution, an individual is considered to be destitute in sanitation if they have no type of facility at all. Here we have the different cutoffs, the deeper cutoffs for each of the indicators that we changed, which are 8 of the 10 indicators. In the case of electricity and flooring, the indicators, the cutoffs were not changed, but in the other 8 indicators they were. So we are identifying a subset of the MPI poor, who are those who are, besides being multidimensionally poor, they are also destitute. They are much deeply poorer than the general MPI poor. And what we find, it's like actually it was quite of a sobering picture. We were expecting to find that the number of people that were facing these deeper cutoffs was not that large, but we found that over 800 million people in the world are destitutes. So this is a very large number of people that are in a very severe situation of poverty. And what we find is that this is 1.2 billion MPI poor that are living in this situation. It's half of the MPI poor. This analysis was done in 49. This analysis was done in 49 out of the 108 countries that we included in the MPI, but we were covering 3/4 of the total MPI poor that we had in our sample, so it was quite representative. And what we find is that the percentage of MPI poor who are destitute is not exactly the same across geographical regions. So in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or South Asia, it's about 50% of the MPI poor, while in other regions of the world, it's around 25% or even lower, like in Arab countries or in Europe and Central Asia. Yes, I'm almost done. And here what we find is, what we were trying to analyze here is how are these people destitute? How are they, which are the indicators that are more relevant to identify them as destitute? And what we see is that, for example, in the case of the more strict cutoff for schooling, we find that 41% of the destitute are identified in a situation in which there is no one in their household that has completed not even 1 year of schooling. 67% of the destitute live in a household in which at least one member is in severe undernourishment. Almost 70% of them have no kind of asset at all, not even a radio or a cell phone. And almost 90% of the destitute actually have no type of sanitation. They are using open defecation. So what we see is that all these indicators are relevant to identify. There is no just one of these indicators that is pushing people to be destitute, but all these indicators are actually equally important. So again, here is just a comparison to see how when we have countries that have a similar proportion of people that are living in, that are identified as poor using an income measure, what we can see in the horizontal axis, like we have Swaziland and Niger, for example, have a similar proportion of people that are living under the poverty line of $125 a day. But what we see is that the proportion of people that are identified as destitute varies a lot, from 8% in Swaziland to almost 70% in the case of Niger. So again, we see how these measures, the multidimensional measure and the income measure that is more traditionally used, they are actually providing very different information, and they should be considered as complements. They are all adding information that is different in the case of these individuals. But the good news is that we found that for the countries that we were able to compute destitution over time, that again was mainly done by Anna and Sabina, we found that actually the countries that had the largest proportion of people identified as destitutes are those that have improved the most. So they have all improved quite a lot, especially Ethiopia. It has been our champion in improving destitution, where actually we've seen an improvement of 30 percentage points in a period of 11 years. Which was a very impressive improvement over time. So just to sum up, just to conclude, this is a picture that actually Sabina presented yesterday, and that we tried to emphasize in every one of our presentations, that the MPI works as a zooming lens. Basically, we are able to provide more focused information and more precise information of people that are allowing us to identify deeper deprivations and to have a better picture of the situation in which they are living. We are now able to present a more complete picture, a more complete description of who are living in poverty. And the final comment that I want to make is that, like, again, we always say that when we are presenting the global MPI, is that this is just one particular example that was computed using the Alkire-Foster methodology. It's a very acute measure of poverty, and the basic objective is to have an internationally comparable index for over 100 developing countries. But again, I think that the interaction with countries and the presentations about national measures are providing a lot of valuable information for countries that are working on this, so that they see that this methodology can actually be tailored to national needs and to national contexts, which are sometimes very different from the global MPI. That's all.